So yeah, this is a work with some colleagues, Katie Carmen, Kathleen Mullen, and Shalini Nataraj at RAND. Want to acknowledge first support from the National Science Foundation for this work, but since time is limited, I'm going to get right into it. This particular section is on employment, right? Like obviously the pandemic has had enormous varied impacts on every aspect. We're really looking at employment and specifically working conditions. And what I'm going to be focusing on in this particular talk is on telecommuting. Kind of what we've been referring to as remote work. By that meaning kind of not having to leave home to work is kind of how we operationalize that in our questions, and also measuring kind of how many days that you worked without leaving home. But we also have kind of a range of other measures on schedule flexibility and sick pay and things like that. We're drawing on the ongoing RAND American Life Panel for longitudinal analysis. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the idea here is that jobs aren't designed for a pandemic, right? But impacts intrinsically vary, as Dan discussed before, right? Some allowed telecommuting before the pandemic, even if people didn't exercise it. Whereas other ones, right, like ER doctors or flight attendants, you have to be there to do the job, and you could put personal protective equipment on, but it's you still have to be there in person. Whereas other ones can sort of adapt over the short and the long term. And so we're kind of looking at subsequent variation in work status arrangements, financial security, and we have measures on mental stress. The American Life Panel, it's a modular internet panel. It's nationally representative of the adult US population. It's going since 2006. We've seen so much great work using the Understanding America study, and basically this has kind of the same DNA behind it. Researchers, pretty much anyone can target modules, right, by for the whole sample, but also kind of by characteristics of kind of people with the most recent interview, like if people are employed, or by having completed specific prior modules, and there have been over 550 previous ones. What we did in particular, right, is target those that were employed in February of 2020, before the pandemic, most of whom had also completed this American Working Conditions Survey back in 2018. So we have some benchmark in February, but we also have much more detailed information about their working conditions a couple of years. And we ask about their employment, transitions, occupation, flexibility. We also specifically ask about hours, productivity, and earnings relative to their February job, right? They were employed in February. In the numbers I'm going to show you are in May, June, September. What's going on relative to the job you had in February? And we also ask a bunch of other questions, not too many of which I'm going to get into here, except for financial security, where I'm going to show you some numbers on kind of difficulty meeting expenses. And the major advantage of this, right, like with the UAS, is that we kind of have continuing longitudinal information on workers. And we had this kind of before and now during the pandemic, hopefully also after the pandemic, whenever that is, but it's ongoing, and we continue to get these kind of working condition measures, and it's weighted to the working age population. Just give you some sense of which surveys we have, right? In May, we interviewed over 2,000 people, but really that was a broader survey that asked a lot of different things. We kind of focused on almost 1,300 respondents who were working in February. We re-interviewed them in June and re-interviewed them in September with pretty high kind of response rates. So some of the takeaways, these are like very similar numbers to what Dan showed you. So I guess reassuring that with a different sample, we get the same, which is, everybody's working in February. If you could telecommute in February, you do suffer an employment loss in May, but we get it around 6% basically. Whereas if you couldn't, we have that basically exact same 25% drop in employment, and then kind of some bounce back for those who couldn't telecommute in February, kind of going forward. So there's gaps narrowing, although it's still substantial. If you ask people kind of, are you working as many hours as in February, among the people who are still working, right? So this is people who haven't lost their job this time period. Everybody has this sort of intensive margin drop, but it's a much bigger drop for those who couldn't in February. But that kind of quickly goes away, and there's been some recovery since then, although as you can see, it's still well below kind of as many hours people worked in February. If you ask about productivity, it's actually kind of the reverse pattern for telecommuting, right? So these are people who are still working, right? And if they couldn't both groups suffered this loss, but if you could telecommute in February and you kept your job in May, you see like almost half of workers say they're less productive than in in February. So it's a dramatic drop for the telecommuters. It's still a dramatic one for those who couldn't, but not quite as much. But we've been seeing that recover also since then. So hours drop, productivity drop, kind of what's the impact on overall earnings? And what we see is that it's again, a bigger drop in earnings for those who couldn't telecommute. And there's been some slight recovery, but actually the gap seems to be widening a little bit as those who could telecommute in February, their kind of earnings are catching back up to where they. So what does that mean for difficulty covering expenses? So this is just asking, did you have any difficulty of those covering expenses? What we see is that for those who couldn't telecommute in February, they have more difficulty, right? And these are among the people I was showing you before that are still working in each wave, so they didn't have job loss. But we've been seeing actually some narrowing of that in September, right? So those who are still working in telecommuting, they seem to potentially be running out of liquid resources, things like that. There's been discussions earlier in this conference about people drawing down, retirement accounts and things like that. Like there's this ongoing pandemic is something that's impacting kind of both people, but you factor in kind of the job loss component as well. So this is just everybody, right? And you can see the people who couldn't telecommute in February, the job loss. Yeah, if you kept your job, you're better off, right? As far as meeting expenses goes. The nature though of telecommuting, so all of what I showed you was breaking down by whether people had the option in February of 2020. But we also asked, are you telecommuting? Are you working from home now? And break it apart by occupation. Right? And so if you compare May and September, right, there's a wide range of sort of telecommuting healthcare practitioners, as I mentioned before, right, ER doctors, you have to be there. Teachers were mostly in May, we're working from home, but for kind of this set of occupations, we've been seeing a decline recently, right? So especially for people in educational occupations, there's a dramatic decline. But across the board, there was some kind of short-term telecommuting that was allowed, and then it's sort of being pulled back. For other occupations, right, computer or math occupations, everybody's telecommuting pretty much all the time and continuing to do so. And then other ones, see, maybe it's sort of been adjusting upward a little bit. So I know I'm out of time, but I want to cover a couple more ones. So like sales and healthcare support is going down. So just to summarize, right, like prior ability to telecommute, right, like predicts continued employment, earnings conditional on employment, financial security, but not productivity, actually the reverse of that. And telecommuting options really are shifting. And thinking about steps forward, right, occupations really matter here as far as which ones go. So heterogeneity in the telecommuting trends, as I showed you before, but I didn't show also is if you try to predict that drop in employment, right, including occupation fixed effects, right? So just looking at difference in telecommuting options within occupations, right? Like the importance of that drops by about half. The occupations themselves are explaining a lot of it. So we're kind of in the midst of a more sophisticated analysis, right? We have more detail on pre-pandemic and mid-pandemic working conditions, like flexibility and hostility of workplace that might account for some of these occupational differences. And kind of looking forward, we have more detailed financial security measures and program participation and some measures of psychological distress, but I think we're out of time. So thank you.